Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk. I hope you're enjoying Svelte Summit so far. My name is Josephine. I'm really glad you're here. And today I would like to talk to you about web accessibility when it comes to Svelte. I'm part of the developer relations team at Storyblock, and at Storyblock, we're basically providing a headless CMS solution and trying to make developers and editors happy at the same time. And I just got into web development relatively recently after switching careers. But actually, web accessibility was kind of ingrained into my career from the start, I guess, due to the nature of my first job. And I feel like that's a topic that's way too often still overlooked or just an afterthought. So I was super thrilled when I heard that Svelte was said to be accessibility first, because in my opinion, that in itself is kind of a cool statement. And that's also the reason why I decided to give Svelte a try, to see basically if that checks out. And basically, that's also what we're going to do today. So we're going to have a look at Svelte's compiler warning, what kind of errors they are catching, and which ones they might be missing. And also, more importantly, what we as developers can do to bridge that gap. And so we'll get started with the compiler warnings and now have a look at what they're doing. So if you have built anything with Svelte lately, you probably noticed these accessibility warnings that you get. For example, if you are creating an image element and you forget to add an alt attribute. And there are a number of these warnings that are run at compile time and check for accessibility issues, mainly focusing on individual components. For example, we have the autofocus. So if you try to set an autofocus, for example, to an input element, you get a warning because that's considered really confusing and generally not good practice, as it kind of messes with the user's workflow through the page. We also have warnings for tab index. So that's quite similar. If you try to add a positive tab index, so for example, 1, that will kind of raise this element above the normal flow that you would go through when you're using a keyboard to tab through the page. And unless that's like a complete edge case, that's something you should totally avoid because it's, not very expected behavior, I guess, from the user, and that will just confuse them, sighted users as well, but especially if you're depending on assistive technology. We also got required attributes. So again, these are kind of course, considered best practice in general when it comes to HTML. So things like I already mentioned, the alt tag, or adding hrefs to an anchor element, or having the language attribute in an HTML element, things like that, or captions on a video, for example. They provide context to the screen readers, for example, that use this to navigate the page and give the user all the information that they need. So if these are missing, there's a lot of important information for context missing. And another kind of warning that we have is for semantic structure. So I said before, we're focusing mainly on individual components, but here for the fig caption, for example, that's supposed to be wrapped in a figure element. And here it's looking at the direct semantic structure and gives you a warning if you miss that, for example. This is all really cool. And I was really glad to find these. It's quite detailed, and it's really nice that they're already letting you know if you're kind of violating these best practices, because a lot of these general HTML attributes are super important especially for screen readers and for keyboard navigation. However, you're probably sensing there's a but coming. That's of course, not all. There are a couple of things missing. So mainly most things that go beyond the structure or the structure of individual components. So we saw there the fit caption. That's kind of one of the few that identifies a little bit overarching structure, but things like, are you using the headlines in a hierarchical order? Is there just one H1? Is there just one main element, for example? These are also things that are really important to screen readers and for keyboard navigation. And that's something that cannot be covered. Or what kind of landmarks are used? Are they used reasonably? Are there maybe more suitable HTML elements that you could be using to give more context and more information? Is the tab order correct? Can I tab to every single element on the page that's needed? How is the page flow? And also visual things like color contrast, for example, which is really important to make all the parts of the page visible, both for sighted and visually impaired people, but also for situations like you're in really bright sunlight. And of course, you need higher contrast on your page to make it visible. And then also things like motion. So if you're sensitive to specific animations or like flickering of the light, that's something that it, of course, can't detect. But not to worry, there are a couple of things that we can do, and we're gonna look into these now. So what can you do to bridge the gap as a developer between what the compiler warnings already are checking and what's maybe still missing? And we're gonna have a look at checking for semantic HTML, the tab order, and color contrast. And we're going to have a look into that. So I'm going to show you a couple of tools. However, I have to say I have no affiliation with these tools whatsoever. I just like them and got to work with them a bit. If you have any other tools that you are super happy with or that you would like to share, I'd be delighted to learn about them. So please feel free and reach out. And I'm going to move over to the browser and we're going to have a look at some of the tools. So we're going to start off with an plugin that I installed. It's the XDev Tools. I can now open them here in my browser. And they basically enable me to run a test either on my entire page, which I'm now going to do, or just on a part of it. And it gives me a very general check of the page and shows me different kinds of issues and tests automatically. And so, of course, this is an automated test, right? So you will need to check for them, and just because you pass doesn't necessarily mean your page is 100% accessible, and other way around, of course. But it's a good first indication. And what we can see here, for example, okay, so there are 13 issues that need a review. We can then go ahead and skip through them. So for example, here it mentions color contrast. I can highlight it and then have a closer look at this. And I'm assuming right now, because white on what looks like black to me should be sufficient. But this is something that then we could investigate. Okay, so what element is it having trouble here with? I can inspect it in the console, or I could even go and learn more about it if I wanted to find out what kind of requirements are I am missing here. So this is something that gives you a really good first kickoff, so to say, but 13 issues. If that's all, that's already pretty good. And that's a good start. And now if we wanted to go a bit further, we could also have a look at the Web Disability Simulator. This is also quite interesting, especially when trying to figure out, for example, design decisions or usability, because here I can simulate different kinds of impairments through the simulation. So for example, I could go for sight and then say, okay, I want to see what people with color blindness experience my page like. And I can then go check it out. It looks, of course, very, very different. But it's still, everything is still readable. So that's a pretty good start. I could also change this, for example, to sunshine. where you need a lot more contrast, but still things are visible. The images here are a bit brighter, but generally that looks quite good. So this is something you could play around with a bit to get an impression. Of course, this is not 100% accurate. It just gives you a first idea of what different kinds of user groups experience your page as. If you want to go check out the colors a bit more in detail, you could also go ahead and use a color contrast checker. So they're generally, you see here at the bottom, there are 3 different kinds of levels that you could pass. So, there's 1A that's not listed here, and then we have AA and AAA. And they have different requirements for different sizes of the headline, for example, of the test. But I could select a color here and check the foreground against the background, or this is my background color, and then the foreground should be this pink. And I can see here I have a score of 8.13. So that's good. You see here we're passing all the different requirements. For AA standard, I think 4.5 is required. So we're making have some good contrast here. So you could go ahead and check all the different colors that you have in your color scheme and check whether the contrast is enough to meet the requirements that you're looking for. And then we have one last thing I want to show you, which is the tab ally. I can run that tool on my page, and it's simulating what the tab order on my page is like. So of course I can, and I recommend you to use the keyboard to tab through your page and see what an interaction would look like without a mouse, for example. But if you want to visualize that and make sure that you haven't missed anything, you could also go ahead, use a tool like this, and it will show you where your user will land when tabbing through the page. It will reach all the interactive elements, and then you can check whether this is a kind of a logical flow, so to say. And you can see if all the links that you want to be reached are reached. It's quite useful as well. Yeah, that was already it from the tool side. I will go back to my presentation now. And just to recap, if you have successfully resolved all your compiler warnings and are good on that front, you can go check, for example, the page structure with a tool like the XDev Tools, for example, and have a look. Okay, so how's the structure? Are you using the right landmarks? How's your layout? How are the headlines? You can go ahead and check your design against the color contrast requirements that you want to comply with. At least 4.5 as a contrast is recommended. And you can go ahead and either manually tap through your page or use a tool to visualize where your user is going when they use a keyboard on your page. So in summary, I guess we could say, well, the compiler warnings, they're not necessarily a shortcut, but they're definitely a great start, especially at such an early age for a framework. And it's a really good to raise awareness. It's a cool statement, and it's a great start to continue learning and investigating what we can do in terms of accessibility from there. That was already all from my side. Thank you so much for coming to my talk. I would love to hear your thoughts on Svelte and accessibility. Feel free to reach out to me either on Twitter or via email. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference and have a great day.